So much media, so little time. Who keeps track of it all? That would be me. This is Bob Andelman, and this is a Mr. Media interview, broadcast and recorded live on blogtalkradio.com from the new media and baseball capital of the world, St. Petersburg, Florida. So let me say this as clearly as possible. If you don't buy Brian Michael Jenkins' new book, Will Terrorists Go Nuclear?, then the terrorists win. And that may be the last moment of levity in this episode of Mr. Media. Brian Michael Jenkins is one of the world's leading authorities on terrorism. He's been advising the military, government, and prestigious think tanks on the dangers of escalating terrorism for more than 30 years and is currently a senior advisor to the president of the RAND Corporation. Some of the questions that he explores in his book include, are nuclear weapons instruments of coercion or of pure destruction? Are those we label religious fanatics constrained by political and strategic calculations? If a nuclear attack took place on American soil, what life and death decisions would the president be forced to make? Jenkins covers Al-Qaeda in his book, as well as the scenarios and plots covered in movies and novels. He separates real and imagined dangers and gives a level-headed analysis of the situation. Brian, welcome to Mr. Media. Okay, we'll try that again. Brian, welcome to Mr. Media.
Thank you very much, Bob.
How are you?
I'm fine, thank you.
Well, let's jump right in and start with the central conceit of your book. Will terrorists go nuclear?
Well, obviously, the answer to that question calls for prophecy. We don't know. We have to accept it as a possibility. That is a possibility that terrorists might obtain and use nuclear weapons. It's not, in my view, inevitable. There's no evidence that it's imminent. If you ask the experts, the opinions are really sharply divided on this issue. Their answers range from 1 in a million to a virtual certainty. The now famous phrase, not if but when. And there's no distribution curve here. It's not as if the answers sort of peak up around one particular number. If you count to the middle in a median, which you can do in any selection, then it comes out to a 1 in 10 shot that terrorists may acquire nuclear weapons in the next 10 years.
So, I mean, do you consider yourself someone who's out there trying to sell people on, run, hide, be very afraid, or are you put yourself kind of in the middle of that, saying, listen, you gotta look at the variety of possibilities here?
No, let's look at the principal thesis of the book, which is that even in the absence of nuclear terrorism, we do live in nuclear terror. Well, I've just talked about the experts' views. That is the view of the scientists, those involved in intelligence analysis of terrorism, those with specific security responsibilities in this area. Put them aside for a moment. And what is the average American's perception of this problem? Well, according to a recent poll, 2 out of 5 Americans believe it likely that terrorists will detonate a nuclear bomb in an American city in 5 years. Now, that to me is an astonishing level of alarm, and the question you have to ask is, how did we get here? What was the message, the perceptions that got us here? And in looking at that, I had to make a distinction between nuclear terrorism and nuclear terror. Now, what's the difference? Nuclear terrorism is the possibility that terrorists acquire and use nuclear weapons. Nuclear terror is the apprehension of that event. Nuclear terrorism is about terrorist capabilities. It's about evidence. It's about our intelligence information, about assessments. Nuclear terror is about our imagination. The history of nuclear terrorism can be briefly summarized. Fortunately, there hasn't been any yet. But nuclear terror is deeply embedded in our popular culture and in our policymaking circles.
I think I think the problem many Americans have with the notion of nuclear terrorists and nuclear terror, I guess, today is that the administration, the Bush administration, lied so many times to the public about weapons of mass destruction and other threats and so much else that many people find any attempt to even discuss this to lack credibility.
Well, it is disturbing, and as I say, certainly there is a disconnect between our perceptions, at least public perceptions, of the possibility of nuclear terrorism and our behavior. And there's no question that people have become cynical about what has been a relentless message of fear from Washington. You know, Americans, despite our characteristic optimism, there are layers of anxieties. We tend to be obsessed with decline and doom. We worry about America losing its place in the world. We worry about new threats against which we might not have the ability to defend ourselves against. We worry about whether our borders protect our territory or our culture. We worry about subversion from within. There is a lot of anxiety, and terrorists, and to be sure, some in Washington have exploited this fear to create an atmosphere of fear and alarm. And of course, you know, that's what terrorism is about. Terrorism is violence, the use of violence or the threat of violence that's calculated to create an atmosphere of fear and alarm, which in turn will cause us to exaggerate the threat. And so there has been a creation of nuclear terror.
It seemed like 5 years ago, so-called experts, and this is what you're talking about, had the world freaked out about suitcase nuclear weapons and all kinds of things. That it seemed like every day you'd open the paper or turn on the news and there'd be some figment of someone's imagination that was just scaring the crap out of everybody. And it seemed like anyone who didn't look like a Midwestern American citizen might be carrying a bomb. Does that make, I mean, your message that much tougher to
It is difficult. You know, some people say, well, look, this is a serious problem, and we can't dismiss the possibility, and therefore we have to mobilize public attention. We have to ensure that government is allocating adequate resources to this particular issue. So what's wrong with a little fear? Why don't we ratchet up the fear in order to mobilize people to take the measures that must be taken? But you know, fear is not free. Fear actually has enormous costs. Frightened populations tend to be, as you correctly point out, intolerant populations. Frightened populations look for visible evidence of unanimity of belief, a kind of lapel pin patriotism as opposed to the real thing. Frightened populations too willingly, in my view, give up their basic liberties in return for promises from others that they will keep them safe. And so there is a danger. I mean, as I say, this is not a threat that we can dismiss. I don't think it's inevitable. Don't think it's imminent. You know, the debate about the probability itself is kind of a theological debate. That is, on one side there are the disbelievers, on the other side there are the apocalypticians. I suppose in this debate I put myself in the role of a prudent agnostic, and that is, although I don't think it's inevitable, and there's no indication that it's imminent, what we do know is still grim enough, and so we're going to have to take the threat seriously. But that means we're going to have sensible measures that we have to sustain for many years as we live with this threat, as we live through the decades of the Cold War. A terrified population, a frightened population, is not an appropriate platform. It is not a supportable platform for taking those measures.
Let me give out our phone number. If you've got a question for Brian Michael Jenkins, author of Will Terrorists Go Nuclear, give us a call, 646-595-3135. Brian, tell folks a little bit about your background on this issue. What is it that makes you an expert?
I don't know that there's anything that makes anyone an expert. I'm a former soldier. I came to RAND directly from the military and began the RAND Corporation's research program on terrorism in the early 1970s, and have been advising government on this issue ever since. The title of this book, Will Terrorists Go Nuclear, actually steals its title from a monograph that I wrote about the topic in 1975. So my work in this begins 30-some years ago. And at that time, I was invited to a conference at Los Alamos, New Mexico, on nuclear proliferation. Now, here there were nuclear scientists, there were nuclear weapons designers at the laboratories there. And while the focus was nuclear proliferation, they added the concern about nuclear terrorism to the agenda and invited me. And I wrote, I thought, well, what could I tell these august scientists about nuclear weapons? I mean, these are the people who designed and built them. And so instead, I focused my remarks and my contribution on terrorist motivations and on how terrorists go about creating terror and on our reactions. So it was much more a psychological inquiry than a scientific inquiry into the actual construction of bombs. And ask questions as to, well, why would terrorists go nuclear? What advantages would they see in nuclear weapons? I pointed out at the time that there were things that we knew terrorists could do at that time that they weren't doing. We knew they could build bigger bombs. We knew they could plant these in public areas, but they didn't do so. And so I thought, well, there must be some further constraints beyond the technological constraints. There must be some self-imposed constraints. And over the years, we discovered what these were. Terrorists worried about maintaining group cohesion. Not all of the members of the group might have the same stomach for violence, and that would risk any extreme operation to betrayal. They worried about not alienating their perceived constituents, and they always imagined themselves to have legions of supporters. They worried about not provoking the kind of government crackdown that would destroy the organization. Some of them had concerns about morality. Some of them had concerns about their self-image as warriors. A kind of, what is it appropriate to do? Kill millions of innocent bystanders or focus their violence? Now, these constraints were not universal and they weren't immutable, and over time, certainly they did change as terrorism escalated through the years. But terrorists, it turns out, are far more complex than we tend to see them. We sort of tend to see them as two-dimensional cartoon figures.
Yeah, I don't know how that would have happened. Let me think. Movies, television.
It's interesting. It's actually a part of it is popular culture, but it's something more. And that is, what is fascinating is, go back to I'm sure you and your listeners probably saw the movie Patton, in which George C. Scott, brilliantly playing the role of Patton, at one point in the movie, he triumphs over Rommel's armored columns in North Africa, and he shouts out triumphantly, "Rommel, you magnificent bastard, I read your book." Well,
right, I remember that. Right,
great line, a great line.
Yeah.
And of course, we did read the books written by the German generals on strategy and tried to understand it. During the Cold War, we devoted a great deal of analysis, of scholarship to understanding Soviet behavior, not just counting Soviet missiles or tank divisions parked in Eastern Europe, but to understanding how the Soviets might make their decisions, how they viewed war, how they thought about strategy. In fact, our deterrence strategies depended upon a good understanding of Soviet behavior. And similarly, they had a good understanding of our behavior, and therefore there were these finely tuned strategies of deterrence that kept the world from going to nuclear war. When it came to terrorists, however, we have tended not to devote the same attention to understanding the terrorists. And when I say understanding the terrorists, I don't mean to be understanding of the terrorists. I'm not mitigating their violence in any fashion. But what we did do is we consigned them either to the realm of crazy behavior, these are mad dogs, or to the realm of evil, witches are wicked, dragons breathe fire, terrorists are evil, no further inquiry necessary. And therefore, our understanding of terrorist behavior, of our principal adversaries right now, Al-Qaeda, is this sort of two-dimensional cartoon, a cartoon-like notion. And if that is your understanding of your foe, then, in a sense, your strategies are going to be, in a sense, two-dimensional kapow-like strategies, not anything more sophisticated than that.
So how do you study a foe that you can't see? I mean, it's, when it was the Soviet Union, well, it was a pretty big, it's a pretty big entity. Even the Palestinians, if you're Israel, well, there they are. I mean, but when you're talking about terrorists, even going back to like the IRA, before Americans thought they had to deal with a terrorist threat, the British were dealing with the IRA. Kind of they knew where they were, but kind of they didn't. So I mean, it's so much harder to study, and then
it is more difficult, no question about it. But let's take Al-Qaeda. I mean, Al-Qaeda has an enormous communications department. We've seen a steady stream of audio and visual material from Osama bin Laden, from his second-in-command, Sheikh Ayman al-Zawahiri, from other key leaders among Al-Qaeda's leaders. They produce books, strategic documents, lengthy treatises, essays. There are thousands of websites, chat rooms, bulletin boards on the internet, populated by the jihadists where they argue about these things. We have, over the years, arrested, taken into custody, a number of jihadists, including some of their key operational planners. We intercept, through intelligence sources, a lot of their messages. And then on top of that, we do have their visible behavior, the kinds of attacks that they carry out. And that gives us a window into their tactics, their target selection. We also have fairly good information about the plots that have been uncovered and thwarted. And again, that tells us a great deal about their ambitions. And so from all of this material, and it actually turns out to be a vast amount of material, of what they say and what they do, that does allow an analysis of how they view the world, how they view warfare, how they view their struggle, how they view weapons, and of course any analysis of this type is going to be imperfect, but certainly there is a vast amount of material that can be looked at.
If this is something I've never really understood, as much technology as we have, even before the internet, we were able to track spies and counter spies and black ops and all that kind of thing. And now we have the advantage of the internet and all this online stuff you were talking about. Al-Qaeda has this huge machinery that puts out its views and stuff. Why on earth? I mean, is it that we are incompetent technologically? Do we lack the will to put this down, or are the wrong people making the wrong decisions with regard to tracking Al-Qaeda and being done with them?
Well, actually, since 9/11, there has been undeniable progress in reducing Al-Qaeda's operational capabilities. We did go into Afghanistan and remove their Taliban protectors. We did disperse the Al-Qaeda training camps. We did manage to remove some of the key operational planners, and that's talent that's not easily replaced. As a consequence, not of our actions, as a consequence of unprecedented unanimity of focus and cooperation among the intelligence services and law enforcement organizations of the world, we have made their operational environment a lot more difficult, dangerous for them than it was before. The kinds of transactions that preceded 9/11, the movement of people back and forth across borders, the communications, the transfers of money, all of these things are much more closely monitored now, and therefore really pose greater risk for the Al-Qaeda terrorists. And we have been discovering and thwarting a lot more plots than we were doing so in the past. Now that clearly is progress, but there also have been failures. We haven't been able to apprehend Al-Qaeda's top leadership, bin Laden and Zawahiri and some of the others. After tossing the Taliban out of Afghanistan, we didn't pay attention to Afghanistan anymore. Instead, we went off to invade Iraq, and that allowed the Taliban and Al-Qaeda the breathing space and room to recover and reconstitute themselves along the Afghan-Pakistan border, where they are now waging an escalating insurgency in Afghanistan. We haven't blunted Al-Qaeda's narrative, this myth that they broadcast that nonetheless has appeal and can turn angry young men into weapons. We haven't really seriously impeded their recruiting. We haven't publicly turned around a single one of those that we have had in our custody, and so it's a very, very mixed view. Success in some operational areas, while we pounded on our operational capabilities, but in terms of dealing with the ideological challenge, the message, the recruiting, the radicalization, the violence, there we've been much less successful.
I'll come back to the question I started. I sort of asked was, do you think if different people were running our side of the operation, we'd be having more clear-cut success in this? I think most people are just so freaked to think. I hate to use the word freaked. It sounds like I'm a 12-year-old, but people are they can't really get their arms around that this has gone on longer than World War II.
It has, and I think, first of all, there war in our view, war in a Western view, and especially in an impatient society like America, is a finite undertaking. It has a clear beginning and a clear end. And being a nation of pragmatists, we want to see where we are in return for our investment and time put in that particular enterprise. During World War II, of course, we had the benefit of a front line that we could watch on a map, and it was sequential. Invade and land at Normandy, liberate Paris, cross the Rhine, head for Berlin. We don't have that now, and indeed this war, and I should put that word in quotes, is a struggle of a different sort. I should point out that in our adversaries' point of view, war is a perpetual condition. Or to put it in the chilling words of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, war is life. Whereas we look for progress, war for our terrorist adversaries is process-oriented. What do I mean by that? I mean that they derive satisfaction by mere participation, not whether a battle is won or lost, or whether they are making material progress as we might measure that. They don't worry about timetables or metrics. Those are Western things. Mm-hmm. By mere participation, they believe they are defending their community, they're defending their society, they are defending their souls against the temptation of corruption by the West. They are guaranteeing themselves a quick passage to paradise. All of those are benefits that they receive regardless of the outcome. And so in their view, to use again Osama bin Laden's words, this conflict began centuries ago and will continue until Judgment Day. Now, the first order of business for us, therefore, is to recognize that this is going to be a long-term enterprise. And the minute you recognize that, then strategies begin to change. And instead of thinking you're going to get a quick victory, we'll get there in a few years, as we did in World War II, you begin to think of how you can conserve resources to sustain a long struggle. Now, when I say conserve resources, I mean not only the lives of soldiers and not only national treasure, because we've spent hundreds of billions of dollars on this, but also popular support and, above all, our values. And that probably is the biggest criticism I have of the way we have conducted this. Now, again, I'm a former soldier. I'm not squeamish about violence, but values are terribly, terribly important here. Some people regard the values as constraints that prevent us from doing what needs to be done. Some regard the basic values as luxuries to be tossed overboard when we hit stormy waters. In fact, those values are a key component of our arsenal. And that is what is going to sustain American spirit, American courage over the long run. And that really is our ultimate defense. Not concrete bollards, not walls, not new laws on wire surveillance, not extension of executive authority, but those fundamental values is what this is about. And if we, as a consequence of fear, surrender those values, then the terrorists have won.
Brian, I want to give out our phone number again, and there was someone actually holding on while you were talking, and if they're listening still, I'd like to invite them to call back in, and we'll get them right on. If you've got a question, 646-595-3135, 646-595-3135. Have a question for you from the live web chat that accompanies Mr. Media interview. Someone named Right Winger, not Winger, Winger, Is it fair to say Al-Qaeda is led by wealthy, narcissistic men who view religion as a tool to recruit poor young males frustrated by poverty?
Certainly in the case of Osama bin Laden and Zawahiri and a few of the others, these are individuals that come from upper class backgrounds. In the case of Osama bin Laden, an extremely wealthy family. In the case of Zawahiri, a family that was able to put him through medical school in Egypt. Are they narcissistic? That tends to be a personality feature of most terrorists. True. Do they see religion as a tool, or do they truly sincerely believe what they say? I don't have an X-ray for a man's soul, so I can't assess their sincerity. They behave as if they believe. They say they believe, and so that's as far as we can take it. Do they recruit poor young men? In fact, they recruit poor young men. They recruit educated young men. They recruit, in some cases, rich young men. I mean, those who carried out the attack on 9/11 were not scraped up off the out of the slums of any major city. These were young men in university, in studying abroad, getting advanced degrees. At the same time, are there some angry young fools that are willing to strap explosives on themselves and blow themselves up? There is that as well.
Brian, we've got this caller back. Hi, thanks for your patience and thanks for calling back. Did you have a question for Brian?
Sure. We are basically dealing with religious fanatics, and as you said, this has been going on for thousands of years. How is the West supposed to approach a fanatical group that has, the belief of Allah, behind them, and controlling a situation where it seems as though we are, dealing with irrational individuals that care so little for their own lives that they're willing to die, that we can stop the terrorism that's going to continue. And the question with regards to nuclear armament, because there's so much money being funded behind their organization, it's only a matter of time that they get their hands on something, and will use them against the West. I think that we're kind of operating in a very naive belief that this is never going to happen, and what can we do? Because I agree with your comment about having a long-term strategy. It's not going to be solved overnight. And the ethics of fighting this battle it seems to be kind of a no-win situation.
Those are good questions, and let's try to address them. First of all, we are going to go after Al-Qaeda. When it comes to dealing with the Al-Qaeda terrorist enterprise, I am the equivalent of the Roman Senator Cato, who used to end every single one of his speeches with the statement, and furthermore, Carthage must be destroyed. And in this case, in my view, Al-Qaeda must be destroyed. And by that I mean its operational capabilities must be smashed because it was responsible for 9/11, because it continues to exhort and instruct young men to violence, because it continues to be a threat, and because of the possibility that if left untouched, they will attempt to acquire weapons of increasing destructiveness, and I'm not willing to take that chance. So if they are the ones most likely to go nuclear, they must be destroyed as an enterprise. Now we get into this belief issue. Certainly the United States does not have, as a nation, the credentials to enter into theological debates regarding Islam, nor is that our purpose, nor need we do that. Nonetheless, we do know we can get better at impeding their recruiting, at waging political warfare, at turning some of these people around. There have been dropouts from this jihadist enterprise. They have written about their experiences. We can utilize this material. We can try to turn around some of those who are in our custody and have them essentially send the message out to others to use adolescent language here, but the fundamental message, jihad is defined by Osama bin Laden, sucks. This is not something to get into.
So why is that CNN or any of Fox Networks or any of these companies, broadcasting and really bringing that kind of information to the forefront, to help? I mean, because that would seem to be a valuable tool to have, people that have, so to speak, defected say, this is not our belief, this is not what, the Muslim, religion is about. This is not, it's not about killing, it's not about revenge, it's not about the West being the evil, empire, and it's not about bin Laden being written in the books. And if I think that if the media, I mean, that would be an interesting story, and I think that would be very relevant and pertinent for us as a society and for the rest of the world to see. But that's kind of put under the table, and it seems as though it's always the West, it's the bad guys. Yet you hear these people coming in and blowing up. Because but there's a lot of people that say, you know what, just go. Why doesn't the United States just go in and wipe them out? Screw them. Right?
The issue is, first of all, again, back to values, but second, it's not clear what that would accomplish. I mean, when we say wipe them out, I mean, certainly Al-Qaeda, where we can get them, we will get them and do try very, very hard.
But why are we having such a hard time?
Again, look.
The great U.S. military can't seem to, to do a bunch of guerrilla guys that will, that seem to be kind of making us look a little silly.
Well, look here. Let's be realistic about this. You mentioned earlier the IRA. The IRA represented a few hundred operatives. Mm-hmm. They lived for the most part, in the United Kingdom, although some were in the Republic of Ireland.
Right.
They spoke the same language. There was no difference of religion. There was no religious fanaticism involved. They basically were an underground organization. The British are not the Afghans. They're not the Pakistanis. They are very, very effective. And it took the British 25 years to bring them down. 25 years operating against them on their own territory where they had access to them. Even some of these tiny little terrorist groups like the Red Brigades in Italy or the Red Army faction in Germany, it took 10 to 15 years to run them down. It is not easy to run down terrorist organizations, and here we're dealing with one that is global and
well funded,
and well funded, and so it is going to be a long contest. And as I say, the first thing you recognize is that it is going to be a long contest, and therefore you adjust your strategy accordingly. Mm-hmm. So the time is understandable. But back to the point on the media, what is fascinating and is kind of a disturbing paradox is if this nation, our own country, we're the people that invented the Internet. We invented the 24-hour news network. We are a media-drenched society. We know more about marketing. We can sell soap, better than anybody in the world. We're really good at this, and yet when it comes to psychological operations, political warfare, we tend to be flat footed in this area. Part of it is a certain amount of arrogance that comes from having such superior military technology that we tend to overlook some of the political aspects of these contests. Take the example of Iraq. I mean, yes, we can drive tanks across the desert at 60 miles an hour, shooting all the way. You know, we can get to Baghdad in 3 weeks. The good news is we have Baghdad. The bad news is we have Baghdad. Now what? And finally, we learned that it wasn't going to be the main battle tank that was going to make progress in Baghdad, but the much messier task of dealing with tribal chieftains, of turning the Sunnis around, of recruiting them, of doing a lot of other more complicated things. And we're learning those same lessons again in Afghanistan. We just have not really developed the institutions or applied the expertise that exist in this country to the political, ideological contest. And again, during the Cold War, we had Radio Free Europe, we had Radio Liberty, we had the United States Information Service. During World War II, the British had something called the Political Warfare Executive to bring this together. We have no such equivalent today. Again, we think we're going to do this with knockout blows because we have superior military technology, when in fact the nature of this struggle is intelligence, law enforcement, arrests, political warfare, reaching local accommodations with tribesmen in Afghanistan or Iraq or in other places, turning people around, putting them on the air, something that is difficult, but nonetheless, the country has a talent for it. We just haven't taken that route.
Well, but we have what's called the United Nations, which seems to be a unique house of diplomats that, to some extent, it's like a big family that you can never get everyone to agree at the same time on the same issues, and so so often things don't get accomplished. Yet this is a problem that is affecting everybody now. Terrorism is happening all over the world, from Asia to across the globe, and you don't know when. I mean, what was it, the Marriott Hotel that just got blown?
You're right.
That's why it becomes really, as we all know, a global issue. And so, I think the arrogancy of the United States and its military powers needs to be set aside, and we need to roll our sleeves up as a global team to solve a global problem.
We actually, putting aside the debates that go on in the UN itself, which the UN has its utility and it can provide a measure of international support.
I'm going to listen to you because I've got to hang, but I appreciate it. I'm going to listen to you on your answers on the internet. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you for calling.
But let me just continue. We have had, interestingly enough, a measure of international cooperation on this. The international cooperation in dealing with this has been extraordinary. Now, part of that is driven by self-interest. I mean, as Al-Qaeda carried out attacks in Saudi Arabia, in Egypt, in Morocco, in Indonesia, Muslim countries, those countries realized that this was a threat to them too, and so they have mobilized and become part of a cooperative network in dealing with this. But again, it's going to be a long-term task. I mean, Italy has been dealing with the mafia for centuries. Terrorism is going to persist as a mode of conflict, as a mode of political expression, and perhaps better than the war on terrorism, which implies, again, in a Western context, a beginning and an end. The previous words that were used may have been better, and that is, we used to talk about there was the Office for Combating Terrorism. Combating terrorism is a verb that implies an enduring task. And I think this is an enduring task. Now, ultimately, I am confident that Al-Qaeda will fade away. That is the ultimate fate of terrorist groups. Not that they are ultimately destroyed down to the last man, but that their leaders, locked in their own little tiny universe of discourse, become increasingly irrelevant as the world moves on to other issues. So perhaps someday, years from now, Osama bin Laden from some cave somewhere in the mountains will be issuing his 500th audio tape, and no one will care. He will become completely irrelevant. But we want to make sure that before that time, that this enterprise doesn't acquire weapons of mass destruction, and therefore we come back to the necessity for the relentless pursuit of Al-Qaeda, in addition to doing these other things that will hasten the ideological demise of this terrorist foe.
All right, Brian, I'm going to jump in here. We've got a fellow, a caller. I can't assume it's a man. We've got a caller who's been waiting quite a while. Hi, do you have a question or comment for Brian Michael Jenkins?
Yeah, I actually wanted to get back to something maybe a little more fundamental.
Okay.
We hear a lot about from politicians and other world leaders that say Al-Qaeda hates Westerners for their wealth and for our success in the world and for our values. But at the same time, we can see that many of Al-Qaeda's leaders are wealthy, educated men. And many of the attackers from 9/11 were educated. And at the same time, they're perfectly willing to carry out attacks even in Muslim countries. And to me, the argument that they hate us for our success and our values and our wealth just doesn't wash. We're not the only people being attacked. I guess my question would be, what, in the guest's opinion, what is the reason that they hate us so much? What fuels their hatred for the West?
You know, you're looking for a combination of individual psychology and political ideology here, and that is, in terms of the ideology as they describe it, they see the West as a source of aggression to their own way of life, to their own belief system. They see the West as a source of corruption. That is a threat to their own souls. That they will be, that their belief will be somehow diluted or potentially diverted by exposure to this onslaught of Western culture, and Western culture is in a sense this powerful instrument. I mean, in terms of television, movies, music, and to those who subscribe to a very traditional way of life, this is seen as a direct threat. Now, where individual psychology comes into it, there are people who are looking for meaning. Their souls are running on empty. They want a particular cause. They want something that is going to take away the requirement for them to think, even if they are intelligent. Remove the requirement to make decisions, a doctrine, a dogma that will tell them exactly what they do, and they only have to obey. Now, we see the same type of behavior in terrorist groups. We see it in religious cults. In a sense, the seductive call of obedience to a higher cause, and so that clearly is part of it as as well. You know how many of these people are? You don't have to find that many. I mean, out of 1.2 billion Muslims, you find 19 to carry out an attack like 9/11. You find 3 here. You find 6 there. These are tiny. This is a tiny army, but nonetheless one capable of great destruction. Their willingness to kill fellow Muslims, of course, is justified if you see the world in terms of us or them, black or white, with us or against us, and your actions in your mind or in the minds of those operatives are sanctioned by God. God tells you to do this. Then any constraints imposed by ordinary considerations of morality or a strategy may not apply, and therefore they have been quite willing to kill Muslims. Although it's fascinating, back to this issue of political warfare. As a consequence of these attacks, in which hundreds and hundreds of Muslims have been killed, far more than infidels have been killed, there is a backlash, and not simply a backlash among bystanders in the Muslim community, but even within the jihadist universe itself. There are arguments about this strategy. What was fascinating is earlier this year, on the jihadist websites, they had this basic program where you could submit your questions to Al-Qaeda's number 2, Zawahiri. Ask Zawahiri a question. Make your comments. It wasn't an interactive talk show like this one is, where you can answer the questions directly, but you could submit questions, and Zawahiri will answer you. And what was fascinating about it is that the leadership of Al-Qaeda found itself on the defensive, having to rebut a lot of allegations just along the lines that you had mentioned, in terms of why are you killing so many Muslims, and this is inconsistent with our beliefs, and in fact it's inconsistent with our view of our own struggle. This is unmanly, was one of the allegations against one of their attacks, because it simply killed a bunch of ordinary civilians. This is not the action of a warrior. This is the action of a coward. And so there is this debate going on right now, divisions within the jihadist element itself, which can lead to cracks that in fact can split this thing open.
Well, thank you very much for your call. We're just getting to the point of winding down here, but it was a good question and made for good discussion. So thanks for calling in.
Thank you.
All right. Brian, I have one last question for you before we wrap up here. I'm just wondering if either of the two major party candidates, McCain or Obama, strikes you as being, which one of them strikes you as being best prepared to deal with terrorism as an issue, and perhaps, hopefully, differently than the current administration has dealt with it?
I'm ferociously nonpartisan, and because, of course, my affiliation with a nonpartisan research institute must remain so publicly. What is fascinating here, let me just sort of quickly describe what are the differences between the two on national security matters, on terrorism matters. Mm-hmm. I think the campaign process itself tends to exaggerate differences on trivial issues, and because they're looking for ways in which to criticize one another. So, for example, Senator McCain has criticized Senator Obama for his willingness to engage in a dialogue with Iran, or has criticized Obama for an earlier statement in which Obama said he would go after Al-Qaeda's leaders in Pakistan, which is, of course, exactly what we are doing now. Those aren't the major issues. If you look at on major issues of national security, on the on the need to maintain a stability in Afghanistan, on the need to expand the size of the armed forces, on a lot of the fundamental national security issues. There's not a great deal of space between the two. Even, I'll assert, on the issue of Iraq. Now, many people see great difference here, and the difference is that Senator Obama has said that he will get bring the troops out within 16 months, the combat forces at least. There will still be a residual force within 16 months of his taking office. That puts it out into 2010. Whereas McCain, in response to a question, has said that he would remain 100 years, although that answer was taken out of context. In fact, what he has said is that he would hope to see the combat forces out by the end of his term of office in 2012. So that's a difference of less than a couple of years between the two. The reality is the troops are coming out of Iraq, not at a pace that will destabilize situation, but at a pace that will bring it down significantly. And the real question, the long-term question, is what type of residual force will remain and what will be its mission. And neither has addressed that point. However, while saying that there isn't a huge gap between the two on broad national security issues, there is, I think, a fundamental difference between the two candidates on self-image and philosophy, a fundamental philosophical difference, and that is, while whoever takes office in January will inherit three wars: the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, the continuing war on Al-Qaeda and terrorism. But I think Senator Obama sees that as an unfortunate legacy and would really like to address fundamental domestic issues, the economy, issues of education, issues of health care, despite the constraints imposed on resources as a consequence of these continuing wars. I think Senator McCain, in his language and self-image, in talking about issues of victory, dignity, honor, winning, fighting, very much sees himself as a wartime president, indeed as a warrior. So there is a fundamental difference between the two men. On the issue of nuclear terrorism, neither has described in any detail a position other than the standard refrains about concerns relating to nuclear proliferation and nuclear terrorism.
Well, folks, you can find Brian Michael Jenkins' new book, Will Terrorists Go Nuclear?, at great bookstores everywhere. You can also order it online at Amazon.com or MR Media. It's my site, MrMedia.com. You can also visit Brian's website at www.willterrorists, that's plural, gonuclear.com. That's all solid. willterroristgonuclear.com. Brian, it was a great conversation. I could tell from the callers. We got good questions. The people in the web chat had very intelligent things to say. I think people were very impressed with the way you approached the issue, and I just want to thank you for your time. It was very interesting to talk to you today.
Thank you very, very much for the opportunity. And one last comment about the book. The book doesn't tell you what to think. The book makes you think.
Very good. And we will let it lie there. Thanks very much for calling in today, sir.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye. And folks, for dozens more media newsmaker interviews, surf over to our main website, www.mrmedia.com. And please think about writing an online review of Mr. Media, casting a vote for Mr. Media, or marking Mr. Media as one of your favorites, whether you listen on Blog Talk Radio, digitaljournal.com, Podcast Pickle, Vox, Folio, Mediafly, Podfeed, Blueberry, Zencast Audio, the Kindle Reader, or iTunes. And if you've got an idea for a guest, please email me directly at bob@andelman.com. Thanks so much for joining us today. I always appreciate when you take a little time out of your day to spend it with us, and I hope you'll come back again real soon.